Good morning and welcome back to Planet Althistory. Today we are going to discuss what if Persia never existed. The Persians are an Indo-European people which immigrated a long time ago to the Iranian plateau. The Persians are nowadays known for their war against the Greeks, which they lost, but also for many other things. The Persian language, of course, is one of them, the huge empire that they used to have, or the huge empires, especially the Achaemenid Empire, the fact that they freed the Jews from Babylon and let them return to the homelands, Zoroastrianism, the first written human rights, Persepolis, their administrative system with the satraps, which proved to be very useful for quite some time, and there is also much more to it. Without Persia, much of the world would be different. But which Persia are we talking about? The Achaemenids, the Sassanids, or even Iran nowadays? Well, we will go back to the time where the Persians came to the Iranian plateau. Medes, for instance, was already Persia. Thus we will cut everything away that is in any way related with the Indo-European or the Indo-Iranian, and we will just keep the Elamites. Yes, and now with the Elamites, don't understand me wrong, this doesn't mean that we will not have a no Indo-European timeline. It will be quite the opposite. Of course we will still have Indo-Europeans, but it will just be with a little twist. In this timeline, the Persians would just be repelled by whoever ruled the Iranian plateau, or by the Elamites, and later on they would just be absorbed into the mainstream culture, because this is what usually happened when Persia or Iran was conquered. I mean, it never became fully Arabized, it never became fully Mongol, it never became fully Hellenized, but the rulers of that said region, they always integrated into that mainstream culture. As a point of divergence, we will take the war that took place between the Elamites and Nebuchadnezzar I. It was because of this war that we can say that the Elamites were declining in power and they had problems to rule over the Iranian plateau. They also started to lose their eastern lands, they also had less written texts, and at the end they were replaced by the Persians, probably due to the fact that they also had a much higher birth rate. With a stronger Elamite rule over Iran, much of the invaders from the steppes would gradually just integrate after 2 or 3 generations. And as I said before, the same always used to happen in Iran or Persia, whatever you want to call it. Probably in this timeline it will just be called Elam. So why shouldn't it just happen in this timeline as well? If we keep the Elamites strong enough, not only will we have a balance of power in that region, but also no Persian Empire whatsoever in the long run. The Bronze Age collapse will still happen, and that's probably the time where the Elamites, they can shine. They might even get as far as taking all of Babylonia, or even crush the Assyrians, so there will be no Assyrian Empire at the end. With more Iranian peoples arriving, the Elamites would also have to deal with them, and having no competition or any front, especially in the west, will free a lot of resources for them to just deal accordingly with the steppe hordes that would come to the northern and also even the eastern parts. It will take them probably a few decades. There will be also centuries where they will have to even become more stable. We will also see probably like a rise and then decline, rise and decline. It will not be very linear. But at the end, as we can always expect from that region, there will be an empire whatsoever, only that this time the mainstream culture will be an Elamite culture. And this Elam could still kind of look like Iran nowadays, because if we are checking the borders of Iran, we see that, well, most of the borders that they have, they are geographical borders. And probably due also to the fact that we also had the Bronze Age collapse, would then see that this Elamite empire would be able to sometimes even take a hold on Mesopotamia, for instance. The question we have to ask ourselves is, would Elam be able to hang on or not? Well, as with Assyria, Babylonia, we would get an Elamite empire in name, but not a truthful successor of Elam. In those years, legitimacy was important, and thus the name of Elam would continue and continue. Due to the fact that Babylonia and Assyria always resurfaced, I believe that in this timeline, Elam could do something very similar and just reappear. Yes, again, internal troubles, they will exist, and without stable and stronger states around, I mean, Assyria was then totally crushed in this timeline, nobody could really be a threat to Elam. Something similar with Elam could happen as it did with Medes and the Achaemenid Empire, and then with the arrival of the Scythians and Cimmerians in this alternate 7th century BCE, the Elamites could use them as allies, mercenaries to destroy and raid their neighbors and just have total dominance in that region. And since most states in those years were pretty much fragile or just non-existent, the Elamites would be able to expand. The question right now is, how would they deal with it? If we look into the past, it says that Elam was organized in a sort of federal way, where the king was at the top with many vassals. The king's brother was usually the vice king, while the prince of Susa, so the prince of the capital, was the son of the current king. And with a longer survival of Elam and multiple revolts, it becomes clear that this system would at one point be changed due to this inefficiency. And we could still see something similar as with the Achaemenids in that sense. The Elamites would be thus able to hold for some time into some territories, have some vassal kings or vice kings even, but ultimately fail to hold onto Anatolia, Egypt, or today's Israel, for instance. The Elamites would then be repelled to Mesopotamia. What the Achaemenids, for instance, did was the kings that they conquered, or the kingdoms they conquered, they used the monarchs that used to rule over there as part of the court later on. But I think with the Elamites this would probably not happen at all. And it would be much more difficult for the Elamites to have this control over this huge region. This means that we won't see Greco-Persian wars, no Alexander the Great, and no Hellenic wars. Buddhism, for instance, would also keep more an Asian flair, while Greek will just be spoken in Greece or Anatolia perhaps too, and just spread, you know, in the parts where they used to have colonies, but never until Bactria, for instance. This would just not be possible. On the other hand, Aramean, Elamite, and even the Mesopotamian language, they could act actually as a trade language, for instance, and they could compete with Phoenician, for instance. Without the Hellenic world, there won't be any connection between the East and the West, or just a very weak one. Phoenicia could still be relevant in this timeline and be part of Carthage, or serve as an ally to them, and they would compete with the Greek states, leaving it to more wars and more maritime advancements in that sector. West Asia and Anatolia could become the playground for these powerful alliances between the Greeks, Phoenicians, Elamites, and it would just be the question who would be able to, you know, just do some stuff. And the Elamites, after retaining bigger territories, especially the parts that we know nowadays as Persia, they could become some sort of prototype of nation states. While focusing on the maritime warfare, the Greeks and the Phoenicians would after some time be outclassed by the Romans, because they would not focus really very much on the land doctrines, while the Romans, they would just be able to crush them. And the Romans could at first get an alliance with Elam, and it is possible that for the first decades they would be really good neighbors, and they could serve a very useful purpose to each other. But knowing Rome as Rome and hearing about richness in these lands and probably having some border fights and then getting an ambitious general or emperor, well, it is possible that they would then try to take out Elam. And I think that the consequence would be really interesting, because in this timeline Elam would not be really heavily focused in the western front. Mesopotamia would just be, you know, a land where they would just go over and just take whatever they could and sometimes be repelled. But they would never have this huge empire who could face them and even invade their lands from the west. And thus Elam would be conquered, and the interesting consequence would be that we don't get a Hellenized world, but actually a Latinized world. But also the connection between the East and West would finally be a thing. And with the Roman policies of federati and whatnot, the tribes on the borders of today's Iran could be calmed down for a little while at least. But as always, every empire has to come to an end, and I believe that the chances for Rome to collapse are that they could do that a little bit earlier. Yes, the capital would still be in Constantinople or similar place, because for strategic reasons it would be more than useful to do so, but territories beyond natural borders would be lost after the Romans would not be able to appease certain tribes. And with the Huns, the White Huns especially, and other steppe hordes, the effect would be first felt in Elam and only much later in Europe itself. We could see a White Hun kingdom or Khwarezm kingdom in some parts of today's Iran, a very Latinized or Elamized Armenia, and while Europe itself would also become quite a mess, but at the end similar things would happen as in OTL, at least with Europe, without counting Britannia in, of course, because as Elam would be conquered, there would be no conquest of Britannia. Funnily enough, a long stretch from the Balkans until Elam, I think, would be able to survive. And we would have a very different Byzantine-like empire, one that could very well be a Greco-Elamite empire with some Latin influence. Without the Jews being freed from Babylon and Zoroastrianism, monotheism would most likely take off under a different form, but there won't be this instability due to the Christians and probably also no Islam and thus no Muslim invasion. Trade between the West and the East would blossom, and in this alternate Byzantine Empire there could really be this huge boost where trade would happen in the Red Sea, the Mediterranean, the Gulf of Persia and the Indian Ocean. All of this would just be their playground and a way to make money and become rich. With Egypt as the breadbasket and only some loose Arabic tribes as a threat, the empire, or this alternate Byzantium, could stay for some longer time, and the old world would be much more interconnected and aware of each other. That is, until the Mongols would show up and destroy everything. That would be the time where the remainings of the Roman Empire would start to completely fall off and split off. Perhaps an Elamite successor state could emerge, or Mongol Khanate will keep Elam, and we would see something similar as with the Mughal Empire, and that's where we leave it for now. That's it for today. I hope you enjoyed my video. Be sure to like and subscribe, leave a comment, support me also on Patreon, and join my forum, forum.planetalthistory.ga. Until next time on Planet Alt History.